О'Брайен, доктора права, директора бакалавриата, преподавателя по правам человека, Центр прав человека Эссексского университета, с докладом «Междисциплинарный подход к преподаванию в Эссексском Центре по правам человека. Преимущества и проблемы преподавания прав человека».
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I have a bit of a cold, so I apologise for sounding snuffly. Okay. So first of all, I'd just like to thank the organising committee, particularly Dr. Anton Burkhoff, for inviting the Essex Human Rights Centre to participate in this important conference, and also to our hosts in the Legislative Assembly. It's a pleasure to be here. So my presentation now this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at the interdisciplinary approach to human rights education, drawing on experiences from the Essex Human Rights Centre. So first of all, just to highlight the importance of human rights education. And I think, as mentioned by one of the previous speakers, at this stage of the day, there's some recurring themes. I'm going to mention things that some of my colleagues have already discussed, but I actually kind of think in a way this is a positive, because it means that there's some parallel lessons that can be drawn, and some similar experiences that we're experiencing in human rights centres and other important human rights institutions across Europe. So just to highlight a declaration that was already spoken a bit more length in the previous presentation, and that's the 2011 United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, and is a resolution from 2011 and published in 2012. First of all, just to highlight, this I think is an important document because it underpins a number of integral points relating to education and human rights education. And in fact, it actually frames human rights education in training in terms of itself being a right. Article 1 underlined that human rights information, access to human rights education is a right. So I think that's important to highlight. So everybody has the right to know, to seek and receive information about human rights and fundamental freedoms, and should have access to human rights education and training. And actually, when I was looking through the resolution to kind of draw out some articles that I thought were important, I started ticking pretty much every single one of them. So they're too numerous to outline all the articles here. But I also want to highlight Article 2, which emphasises in this first paragraph that human rights education and training encompasses all educational training, information, awareness raising and learning activities. So a holistic approach to human rights education. And these activities are aimed at promoting universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And why this is important is because it contributes, amongst other things, to the prevention of human rights violations and abuses by providing persons with knowledge, skills and understanding and developing their attitudes and behaviours to empower them to contribute to the building and promotion of a universal culture of human rights. My own research actually focuses on human rights violations and what happens when the rights that we have are violated and what remedies there are. And I think this is an important corollary to that focus, in that if we don't know our rights, if people don't know their rights, how can they stand up for their rights? So I just wanted to highlight that and just to give some kind of contextual information on my approach to human rights education. And I also want to just highlight an issue again that I think was outlined by previous speakers. But to me, it seems that there's been a proliferation of human rights centres, human rights masters and human rights modules and degrees in Europe in the past number of decades, particularly in the last 10 years. And I pose a question, how can this be interpreted? I'm not attempting here to answer this question, but I thought it's an interesting question to raise. In likelihood, there's a range of factors that converge, but it's worth considering the question and whether any pedagogic lessons can be drawn from possible answers. So to think about, why has there been such a growth in human rights education in Europe, and what are the factors that have facilitated this growth? And now I want to turn and look at the social context of human rights education, and looking at higher education models, educational policy and the political climate. And I'm making reference in particular to the United Kingdom because that's where I work, and that's where the Essex Human Rights Centre is situated. But obviously there are some parallels that can be drawn anywhere we teach human rights. We don't teach human rights, obviously, in a vacuum. It happens within a social context and a political climate or an economic climate. And these factors all determine how human rights education is delivered and the form that it will take. So, factors in the UK that impact on higher level education. One thing is performance measurements. And in the UK is not unique, but the United Kingdom is one country in which it has means of measuring performance within third level, within the third level sector, and within academia. And actually, this has changed the whole language that we use. Universities are run in many ways similar to a business model, and this impacts how we work and how we deliver our programmes. And things that I used to commonly refer to as books or journal articles are actually now referred to as output in terms of performance measurement. We also have league tables, and again the UK is not unique, but this impacts on how we structure our programmes and how we're measured in our performance. Another performance measurement is securing research grants, and obviously research grants are important to enable us to carry out the research that we need to carry out, and that in turn influences our teaching and our programmes, but it's also another way in which academics are measured. And so in some ways academics are chasing the money, and this has an impact on how we structure our higher education programmes. Another factor which was mentioned this morning by our colleague from the Council of Europe is economic factors. So the contraction of the economy, recession. I think most countries in Europe are currently in a recession, and this means that there is a cut in funding for the third level sector. So this obviously has an impact on the resources made available to educational institutions. It also has an impact on student behaviour. In the United Kingdom, for example, undergraduate fees have increased to £9,000 per year. So that means for a 3-year degree, which is the average, a student has a student loan for fees alone of £27,000. So this impacts on the choice of degrees that students will make, and they're making much more informed decisions, which is good from the perspective of students making this commitment, but it has an impact on how we structure and deliver programmes. And the student's choice of career path is, in some sense, restricted by the economic commitment they make, and also their employability, the chances of getting a job afterwards. And I don't think many people go into human rights in order to make a lot of money, and I think this has an impact on student recruitment. We also understand ourselves as operating within a competitive environment. In a country like the United Kingdom, where there are I don't have the exact figure, but there is a huge number of universities in comparison to other countries like Ireland, for example, where I'm from. There's 7 universities. There's a much bigger pool of universities, and universities consider themselves as competing for students. And so again, it falls back into this business model where the focus is not necessarily on the content of the programmes, but on recruiting students for our programmes. And another issue I wanted to highlight is the application of human rights law in courts, both regional and domestic. And obviously in the UK, the regional court would be the European Court of Human Rights. And domestically, the European Convention on Human Rights is incorporated into UK domestic law through the Human Rights Act. And while this is very positive in terms that it can be applied by the courts, it also can have a negative impact. One of the negative impacts is the impact on public perception of human rights law and what human rights law protects and what it does. It's seen by many actually as a charter for criminals, and this is due to the reliance on articles from the Human Rights Act, particularly Article 8 on family and private life. In cases where those who are alleged terrorists are fighting deportation, and also convicted criminals. And how it's reported in the media, and certain segments of the media, is overwhelmingly negative, and actually is leading to a campaign for the repeal of the Human Rights Act and removal of UK from the European Convention. So actually, it's not always a good story when a domestic court uses human rights law and uses it properly. Now the kind of final section, I'm going to look at the Essex model, so drawing on experiences from the Human Rights Centre. So I want to first of all look at the programmes that we have at the Essex Human Rights Centre. We have a range of programmes that teach human rights or incorporate human rights at its core. So at the master's level, we have an LLM in International Human Rights Law, an LLM in International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, and also one in Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We have 2 MA programmes, one in the theory and practice of human rights and one in human rights and cultural diversity. Then we have a range of joint degrees at the undergraduate level, so a law degree that incorporates human rights at its core, but also mixed disciplinary degrees, so BA in Law and Human Rights, Sociology and Human Rights, History and Human Rights, Philosophy and Human Rights, Latin American Studies and Human Rights, Politics and Human Rights. And then more recently we launched a single honours BA in Human Rights. And the scope of the programmes that we have reflect the fact that human rights education extends beyond legal education. The teaching at Essex does not take only a legalistic approach, but also incorporates a multi- and interdisciplinary approach to human rights education. I think this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it offers a rounded human rights education. And in order to enhance human rights implementation, it needs to be embedded across a range of public sector and private sector entities. For example, and I think this was already mentioned, in social work, in schools, in the prison service, in business practice and so forth. The majority of human rights education in the third level, not only in the UK but also across Europe, I think is probably focused, it's fair enough to say, is focused at the master's level. So in some sense there's a gap in terms of undergraduate education. And this can be problematic in terms of student employability and pedagogical arguments from some against teaching branches of public international law to undergraduate students. So I think it's been highlighted the fact that human rights education goes across the spectrum from primary level all the way through to there's no upper age limit on when you should stop learning about human rights. But I actually think there is something of a gap here in terms of undergraduate education in human rights. So the Human Rights Centre in Essex is interdisciplinary. So why an inter or multidisciplinary approach? Well, first of all, as I've mentioned, human rights in Essex is a recognition that human rights has an application beyond the law, and the members of the Human Rights Centre are drawn from both the lawyers and also from other disciplines. So why do we take this approach? Well, other disciplines help us to understand how human rights is applied on the ground. For example, if we take the sociological approach to human rights, this helps us and our students to understand how human rights is understood, how it's applied, and how you can maximise human rights at a social level. It also provides moral authority, for example, the philosophy approach to human rights. And this is particularly important in, for example, the UK, as I've mentioned, the slight backlash to human rights protections, where the starting point for many who work within human rights is that we all have human rights. It's a fundamental principle of human rights. It's universal, it applies to all, and by virtue of our humanity we have human rights, and that's our point of departure. For those who challenge human rights, we need to have another approach, and we need to defend the fact that we have human rights and that it's something that we can apply on the ground. We also have members from the Department of Government, from Political Science, and this is particularly useful for developing measurements of implementation, to apply quantitative measurements to measure the success of the implementation of human rights on the ground. And also members from the Department of History, for example, and this is particularly important also for students when they're learning human rights, to be able to understand historical roots of, for example, a conflict. And we have other disciplines, of course, that interact and engage with human rights to enhance this realisation. For example, forensic sciences, this is my particular area of interest, the nexus between the forensic sciences and human rights, healthcare and medicine. And this is just touching on some of the disciplines that we use. So to give some examples, and this is really just a snapshot of the examples of interdisciplinary research. As I mentioned, my own interest is in looking at forensic science and the use of forensic evidence for international criminal trials. And I look at it from looking at the legal framework, but also how science is used and some of the sociological or anthropological ways to understand this, and tensions that arise in the application of forensic science in a criminal justice context, and how this can actually conflict with other rights grounded in human rights. Then we have, for example, business and human rights. And while traditionally the business sector may not have seen itself in terms of the application of human rights, this is actually a huge phenomenon in terms of the growth and the explosion of interest in business and human rights. And again, a very important nexus for realisation of rights on the grounds, particularly in vulnerable areas like countries where there's the extractive industries operate and indigenous people are moved off their land, for example. Lydia Morris is one of our sociologists who takes a sociological approach to human rights. And increasingly the humanities and arts-based subjects are also applying a human rights lens. And just one example of a project is on looking at film and atrocity. So how is this all fed into teaching? So at Essex is a research-intensive university, and so we practice what's known as research-led teaching at Essex. An important source of funding are research grants, and I think it's probably the same for any university that attracts funding. There's a status attached to attracting prestigious and comparative research grants. And interdisciplinary research is particularly desirable at the moment by funding bodies. There are, I think, some problems with the approach to research in the UK at the moment, and one is research measurement. And I mentioned performance measurements, and one of the systems in place at the moment is the research excellence framework, where the output of all academics is measured in order to award them a star category going from 1 to 4, which is international level outstanding. And universities basically compete to come out at the top of a league table. And so this impacts the direction of the research we do, which again will inform our focus in terms of what we teach in human rights. On a more positive note, the research methodology and training is embedded in modules and assessments across all levels. So what are the advantages of an interdisciplinary approach to human rights education and research? Well, we feel this gives a richer, more nuanced understanding of human rights. Human rights doesn't operate within a vacuum of the law, and by taking an interdisciplinary approach and applying a number of lenses to a human rights issue, I think it enables us to understand a human rights problem, or how human rights is applied in a much more nuanced way. It also means that we can provide human rights education to a much wider community of students. Not all of our students are law students, and this is particularly in regard to the MA programmes that we run and the BA programmes that we run. So we're opening up human rights education to a student body far outside a pool drawn from lawyers. It enables us and our students to have a better understanding of how human rights law can be applied on the ground, and it also facilitates a cross-fertilisation of skills across discipline. For example, the employment of research methodology is not present in law, especially from the social sciences. So it's often said that law doesn't have a methodology, but in order to carry out research, there needs to be a methodology employed. And so I, for example, borrow methodologies from anthropology and sociology in my research. There are challenges to this approach. One is that law dominates the field, and law really is provides the framework for human rights, and so of course it dominates the field. But it means that other approaches are sometimes not seen as being equally important. The engagement of other disciplines with human rights has come at later stages and on an ad hoc basis. So some disciplines are only recently engaging in the subject area of human rights. What this can mean in practical terms is that as human rights practitioners come together from different disciplines, in a sense we're speaking different languages. I view each discipline as a language that you need to learn anew when you study that discipline. And even certain terms have different meanings in different disciplines. And so when you engage in discourse, we're not always speaking the same language or saying the same thing. Another difficulty is when you, within a program, you embed different disciplines. Not all students, some students won't have an aptitude for different disciplines. So they may actually struggle with a particular component of the degree, which will have an impact on the grades and on the outcome of their degree. So this is something that is a question or a problem that we're examining in Essex. Try and think about it in a very thoughtful way, and if anyone has any ideas or suggestions, I'd love to speak with them afterwards, how to fit the pieces together in a coherent manner. We think it's a very worthwhile project, but it's not without its difficulties. And that's it. I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста. Включите микрофон. Микрофон, да. Все.
Да, спасибо большое, доктор О'Брайен, что приехали. Целый день у вас занял вчера путешествие. Я знаю про Эссексский университет о том, что все выпускники Эссексского университета объединились в такую неформальную сеть. Их даже называют эссексская мафия. Они работают во всех структурах, международных, национальных, именно структуры, которые занимаются защитой прав человека. Вот в чем успех программы именно в Эссексском университете? Не в том ли, что, как мне кажется, почти каждый преподаватель в университете, вот в Human Rights, в Центре по правам человека, еще является и практикующим юристом, правозащитником. Может быть, в этом загадка?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Actually, when I was in Galway before I came to Essex, we used to refer to the Galway Mafia, and then I came to Essex and I was like, oh no, it really is the Essex Mafia. There's a huge alumni that works globally, and I think you'd struggle to travel to any place and not meet someone working in human rights that has had a contact with Essex or is a graduate of Essex. And certainly one of the key factors is not only is it an interdisciplinary centre, but also the bridge it makes between theory and practice. And that runs across the centre in a number of ways. So one way is absolutely the members of the centre are practitioners. So they may be lawyers who actively work on cases, or they're advocates, or the research is applied in a manner where it has real impact on the ground or it orientates policy. And this is also something that is embedded within the programmes that we teach. I didn't mention we also have a Human Rights Centre clinic. I'm not sure if the clinic was established when you were there. And the clinic is, again, a bridge between the theory and practice, and it attracts external partners who will basically commission a piece of research or some human rights activity that they want carried out. And students under the supervision of academic supervisor will work on carrying out research and producing maybe guidelines or policy reports, so they have a practical experience. But it also has a kind of real-life value to it as well, that it's producing research that's used by external partners. And I think this approach to human rights, both from the faculty and also how we engage with the students, is one of the keys to the success of the Essex Human Rights Centre. Yeah. Okay.
Хорошо. И нет больше вопросов, да, я вижу. Спасибо большое за ваше выступление. И